IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, I'm Sarthak and I welcome you to one more episode of All Things Policy. Today I have with me my colleague Suman. Suman is a program manager. She is the program manager for our GCPP program. Hi Suman, welcome to All Things Policy.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here, Sarthak, and to be doing a podcast with you first time.
Yeah, we are recording it for the first time. The pleasure is mine. Suman and I have been reading a book, Despite the State, by M. Rajshekhar. We thought we will discuss some of the interesting findings in the book. Obviously, we would recommend you to get the book and read it yourself, and we'll share the link of the book as well. So the book is basically divided into different chapters, and each chapter talks about a specific state, some of the key issue the state faces, and how the state has been trying to handle it or has not been able to handle it. So in this episode, we'll talk about some of these states. We'll not talk about all the states, some of the key states we are going to talk about. So Suman, you have been reading about Punjab.
Yeah.
So what does Rajshekhar say about Punjab?
See, for me, like I said earlier, the Punjab has always been a bellwether state for India. It has shown the way in terms of the Green Revolution in the past, or the kind of even industry, the kind of industries that came about post independence in Punjab. It has always been a forerunner. So what I read in the book actually made me feel like things are not going as great as they promised, as it was promised, or things have actually slid down, down the rails for some reason or so. So what are these reasons? You cannot. Everything is playing. One factor plays into another in a very connected yet not very apparent way. Okay, so that chapter was quite revealing for me in that how all these factors are playing on each other. So through the book, the background is always been the environment, climate change that is taking place across the country. That we are seeing across the world, especially in India. We don't seem to be taking that too much as an issue to reckon with as such, but it is playing a very, very key role in the way the economy is shaping up, agriculture, industry, all of these places. So in Punjab, actually, you see like the Green Revolution. We had seen record wheat production, they were really leading the way in terms of agriculture. So in the book, the author is actually parsing all of this, whatever is happening, through the lens of through these verticals: agriculture, industry, environment, and their effects on the state and its functioning on key areas such as public health, education, etc. In Punjab, the climate change actually he's talking about is the clash in the southwestern and mid-latitude westerly winds. Okay, these winds have seen some change. Therefore, the rainfall patterns are changing agricultural patterns too. Of course, there's not much one can do about that as such. But what the state was doing very well a few years ago is that there was a good information dissemination system earlier. So information that was got about, say, some kind of locust attacks or whiteflies, or they had enough bureaucracy, or the bureaucracy was well oiled enough to pass on this information to farmers. What has now happened is, through the insurgency years, the bureaucracy actually shrunk. And what that has done is the capacity has reduced. And there was a whiteflies incident in 2015, which killed a lot of crop. So there was no information dissemination about how farmers should actually handle this whitefly situation. Earlier, there was that local networks, local, your bureaucracy was passing on information from the weather department or from agriculturists or scientists or whatever, how to handle this. Whereas now, since state has diminished in its role as such, farmers don't get much information on that. Although, actually now with the technology that we have, we should be doing a lot more on that. But we are seeing that having a huge effect on agriculture as such.
So, Suman, one question I had here is why has the bureaucracy's capacity has gone down over a period of time? Has the size increased, or what has happened?
Firstly, like with everything else, the insurgency took its toll. The tax collection system crumbled. So there was, lesser funding and lesser manpower to that. But there has been no effort to revive those systems after the insurgency years. And if there's been very little that has been done. And what has happened through different political regimes and, general liberalization, all of that, while liberalization brought out a lot of good for us, our industry the small like in Punjab, what you see is, they have borne the brunt of partition, the insurgency, a lot of other things, but industry has always dusted itself back. You've always seen, whether it's the garments industry in Ludhiana or the sports goods industry in Jalandhar, or all of these came up closer to, all these small places. But since we did not prep them or for import liberalization, these small and medium firms have been losing their clout, and China has taken over, like if you see footballs or cricket ball, whatever, all of that, they seem to be losing market. But the main reason, as we go along, we see that since the tax collection systems crumbled and the state was taken over by the business interests of politicians, and the running of the state was very closely interlinked. He calls this interessio. I don't know how you pronounce it. It's an Italian term where it's in all other places, the states was separate. Of course, there was corruption. Of course, there is all of this. But in Punjab, the state and the business and all of it is complete. It's just one takeover by one family. So what that did was that they reduced taxes on transport. So all their revenue gathering or revenue gaining, sources, alcohol, transport, or even some other things, all of them, they went tax-free on all those things, as a result of which they had no money for anything. And the only way they're taxing people is through power taxation. Even water bill is a percentage of your power. So once you go on adding cesses to the power bills, what happens is the powers become so expensive. So all these industries are again exiting. Yeah, they're finding it very, very not competitive enough to be there. So they are looking to move out or just shut up. So that's really the sorry state that he talks about over there.
It's interesting. I would have assumed that over a period of time, information dissemination and all these things would have become better, but it's happening the opposite.
Yeah, with technology, one should see that, but that is not so.
One more state, just like you mentioned, right, the issues with revenue. Another state here is Mizoram. So I was reading about Mizoram, and in fact, the author for this particular state, he uses few words. He says that Mizoram is that state which could not pay salaries. So in Mizoram, what he says is, he talks about some officials who play a very significant role, especially for a state like Mizoram. For example, forest officials. Mizoram has a specific kind of demography. It has some tribal groups who have traditionally been involved in shifting agriculture, shifting cultivation. So where they will go to a particular forest, they will basically burn the forest, and on that land, they will practice agriculture. So they have been doing it for centuries. Yeah, zoom cultivation, slash and burn agriculture, different terms are used for it. So now we realize that all these things, this is not sustainable. This is not environmentally sustainable. So forest officials play an important role who can guard these forests. So he takes the example of these forest officials, and he says that their salaries have been pending for months together. Anyway, they are paid very low salaries. They have not been able to pay salaries. Apart from that, health officials who also play a very significant role, especially when it comes to public health in Mizoram. Mizoram is one of those states which is having an international border. It is near the Golden Triangle, Thailand, Laos.
Do they have like a huge incidence of AIDS or some kind of an epidemic?
Exactly. So Thailand, Laos, Myanmar, they are just next to Mizoram, and these are the places where you have opium, heroin, and all these things they enter India through some of these northeastern states, right? So, and many times these drugs get circulated within these places where it enters into the Indian territory, right? So there is a huge prevalence of AIDS. There are instances where multiple people using same needles. So these kind of problems are there. So public health officials also play a very important role here. But what has been observed in Mizoram is salaries for these officials, salaries for these forest guards, they have been pending. And it has a massive implication on Mizoram and its society, its economy. The author says that as forest guards were not paid salaries for 6 months, what happened was some of these forest guards, they themselves started hunting, they themselves started shifting cultivation.
Okay.
So
desperation.
Desperation, exactly. And many of these health officials or many of these people who are supposed to provide condoms, needles, all these things, generally what happens is they have to go to rural areas, they have to go from one place to another, and they distribute these things. They also have mobile counseling units. So again, those who are addicted to drugs. So you have different health officials, health workers, social activists. They will go from place to place and they distribute these things. They provide counseling. But as the state is not able to fund for these things, what has happened is the travel budgets have been slashed. And these social workers, health activists, field workers, they are not able to carry out their duties, as a result of which the number of tests that you conduct for HIV, it has gone down, but the incidence of HIV has increased. So Mizoram has not been able to manage some of these basic things, and which can harm its society, which can harm its economy. And in fact, to address the issue of Zoom cultivation, they also introduced some policies. The Mizoram state government, it introduced some incentives that if households are willing to move out of shifting cultivation, they will be provided some lump sum amount, and with that lump sum amount, they can start some other activity. They will also be provided different kind of technical support. But what has been observed is, despite this scheme, there has not been shift. What happened here was, those who are the initial beneficiaries, they got this 1 lakh amount and they shifted. But afterwards, since the state has a resource crunch, so they were not provided sufficient resources. Maybe the state promised 1 lakh but provided them 10,000, 15,000 rupees. So with that amount of money, it was not sufficient for people to shift their occupations. So
shift, yeah. So they took the money and didn't move.
Yeah, I mean, they're not. See, just think of it, right? You are just giving them 15,000 rupees, and you ask them to start a new economic activity. How it's not feasible,
Yeah.
right? So this is what has been one of the major concerns in Mizoram. The state has found it difficult to pay for the salaries, and the main and what could.
But why are they not able to generate revenue?
Yeah, so this is what he describes in details. Now, if you look at states in India, right? So there are different ways by which they get revenues. One is they generate their own revenues. It can be through taxes, it can be through non-taxes, right? So taxes means, if you have economic activity going on, people are purchasing goods, people are purchasing services, then on these things you will get taxes. And another is non-tax revenues. The state provides certain services, in return it gets some resources. Now, if you look at Mizoram, it is not able to generate sufficient amount of revenue. It is heavily dependent on the union government for different grants. It gets a part of union government's tax transfers, but it is heavily dependent on grants. Economic activity in Mizoram is not up to the mark. One of the major reason is it doesn't have the right kind of infrastructure. The transaction costs are extremely high. Mizoram is at the international border, right? So we would expect that, they have more opportunities.
Yeah.
There is a comparative advantage. They can trade with countries which are on the other side of the border, and people in Mizoram and people in Myanmar, many of them have some ethnic ties. So that is also another comparative advantage. But the infrastructure over there is not good enough. The neighboring state, Manipur, which is also not one of those affluent states, there the infrastructure is comparatively better as compared to Mizoram. So this is what has happened. And the author points to few of the failures here. Like he talks about how there is market failure. He talks about how there are different kind of government failure as well. For example, one of the problems they face is they don't have the right kind of infrastructure. So government also recognizes that, and it has invited tenders for different kinds of construction projects, different kind of infrastructure projects. But the rules and regulations that are there for developing infrastructure, right, generally whoever is applying for the tenders, they have to provide for large some guarantees, huge securities, yeah. And the contractors in Mizoram, they do not have that much amount of resources. They are all small contractors. So as a result of which, most likely these contracts go to some other contractors which is not from the state, and so people over there don't get benefited. Sometimes there can be some smaller projects as well which can go to some local contractors, but here what happens is there is a nexus between the rent seeking is there, regulatory capture is there. Generally what happens, he points a very interesting incident. He says that those who are in power, those politicians basically, so they are the ones who will apply for these tenders, but they don't have the qualification for applying for these tenders. What they will do, they will get the documents from some contractor and they will apply for the tender. Once they get the contract, they will give some commission to that contractor, and then they will sell this contract to some other bidder, right? So basically what is happening, they're acting as an intermediary between the politicians, right? So eventually whoever is building those infrastructure projects, they are not getting sufficient amount of money, they don't have the right incentives. So again, the whatever
I guess there is no audit
Yeah.
also on this, right? Yeah, even the quality of work that gets done.
quality of work will also be not good, because again, at the end of the day, the person who is constructing it, he's not getting sufficient incentives to construct it, right? So whatever projects are there, they're not up to the mark. And again, it has created a mess here. And many of the contractors who come from outside, they get their laborers from outside. So again, local people don't get benefited. Economic activity gets impacted in this region. It doesn't increase as expected. So all these government failures, market failures, etc., have created this kind of a problem for Mizoram. And yes, it has not been able to generate sufficient amount of revenue on its own. And I think this is something which is relevant in the present context as well, and not just for Mizoram. In the last 1 year, just if you look at this entire scenario, right? So states have been finding it difficult to raise revenues.
Yeah.
As we are dealing with the pandemic, revenue streams have also dried down, and the states are at the forefront in dealing with the pandemic. They are the ones who have to provide for healthcare. The frontline workers are from the state, and on top of that, now they have to also pay for the vaccines.
That's true. Yeah. So I didn't see too many solutions coming out in the book. But he's presenting a very, he's doing a show and tell kind of an approach to solving the problem. But yeah, it's very apparent where the problem lies. You don't have to spell it out in that much thing. So it's actually, I would look at it more like foregone revenue, which is coexisting with populism, with non-productive populism, etc. And a small elite is gaining more than the others. That is causing a lot of issues, and it is playing out very differently in Punjab. So the way in Punjab is, see, what has happened is, one set of people have actually taken over the state as such, and it is so intertwined. The state of crime and the state itself is so intertwined that it is hard for people to find recourse to anything. All the small agriculturists are down, all the small businesses are down. So where do they all go for some kind of recourse or some kind of counseling or such? So Punjab is seeing huge rise in religiosity. So people visiting deras, all these deras that we see, although by tradition or Sikhism does not, or a lot of religions do not allow you to worship a human, whatever, a living person also, they're seeing a lot of religiosity. People going to deras are increasing, and they see that, okay, the religion has always given solace to people. They see in a book or in a religious book or or anything, prayer or anything, it has always given solace. But now the frustration is so much that people say that that's not enough for me. I want somebody to listen to me. And that is where the religious heads are coming in. And so there is a demand, the politicians see that these people are going there, and therefore they also go there. The people see that the politicians listen to the religious heads. So again,
It can be a dangerous cocktail, basically.
yeah, it's causing this cocktail of who is going to pull out first. And it doesn't appear that, because all these religious heads are becoming vote catchers, nobody wants to unsettle them or whatever. So that is also causing a lot of social strife within Punjab. So all of this is becoming a heady mix, and one hopes that change in leadership, or even leadership changes, or some kind of philosophers. He's actually, in this book, he's actually bringing out, earlier they had poets like Pash, and who used to show people a philosophical direction also, explain and stuff like that. Now it is, as you get more and more disentangled from the local systems as such, it's, people are finding hard to get out of this, vicious circle that is formed. So that is what is Punjab was about.
So, Suman, apart from Punjab, you also read about Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is usually one of those states which performs exceptionally well when it comes to different socioeconomic indicators. So, what does the author mention about Tamil Nadu?
Yeah, so in Tamil Nadu, I mean, the whole book is more like an ethnographic travel kind of thing. He's traveling across all these states, and it's not so much a urban perspective that you get from the book. He's traveling really into the hinterlands to report, right? So even in Tamil Nadu, he does that. He's visiting all the villages to see how things are panning out as such. So Tamil Nadu is one of those states that were like the forefront of social equity, and the whole thing about elimination of caste and
different kind of anti-caste movements and all emerged in.
So they had seen a lot of success over there, but something seems to have changed even there. Okay, considering that the Dravidian parties were actually AIADMK, DMK, whatever you call it, they all came out from that self-respect movement that Periyar had launched. They came to obliterate caste. But what has actually happened is they have intensified caste identities. Okay, so this caste was one pillar of the Dravidian movement, and the other, an obliteration of caste, and welfareism was the other pillar. Now, both of them, he's tracking how the state has moved on both those issues, on both those pillars as such. Now, because, of course, there was, when we say Tamil Nadu did better on caste and social justice, it doesn't mean that, everything was like one fairy tale land or anything. It was relatively lesser. And they still had their Dalits and, all those issues, the caste friction that was there. But what has happened through the years, like one of the unseen effects of liberalization maybe, it caused migration. Okay? Because Tamil Nadu saw a lot of, relative to other states, they saw a lot of cities emerging. They had Coimbatore, they had Thrissur, Trichy, they had, it's not like, Chennai and the rest of Tamil Nadu, like it is in Karnataka. Karnataka is heavily dependent on Bangalore, right? But it's not, it's relatively less in Tamil Nadu. They have Coimbatore, they have, the various Salem, they have Hosur, all those places. So what happened then was that the lower castes saw that migration was a good route to success, in the sense that they went to these nearby cities and they got more prosperous. Whereas the relatively upper classes stayed back and took over lands, and all of that happened. But again, because of the climate change issues that were plaguing agriculture or anything, they found that they were losers. They lost in this whole thing, and the lower castes were actually gaining a lot more. And that was seen in, in the kind of
Resentment
the
might have been there. Yeah.
lifestyles.
Okay.
Yeah, the lifestyles they had, like TVs, fridge, all of that came into the Dalit homes, and that caused a lot of angst. And they saw that these people are doing much better than us. There is no way to assert their or their caste identities. So what then happened was that the personal became political. So then each party began to stand up for one subgroup, caste subgroup, and they got into honor killings and what was essentially a personal issue, marriage. They became, intercaste marriages, which were once welcomed, was now seen as a source of friction. So it involved caste, leaders coming and approving these weddings, or all of that, and that has caused some friction in the social milieu of the state. When the social milieu gets upset, it will get into other sectors. So, like he's quoting a few people, he says, caste will be the last of the iniquitous institutions that will die, and they will outlast, caste is something that will outlast all other things. So that is about that one pillar of Dravidian parties that he's talking about. The other one he's talking about is welfareism. How did they do welfareism and how it has changed over the years? So that is a different, issue altogether. So welfareism mostly, Tamil Nadu saw infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate was, reducing consistently. But after a point, they're in 2013 they were at about 99%. After the point, it started plateauing. Why? Because you are only focusing on those two metrics, and further reductions in those has to come from more fundamental causes such as poverty, caste, and gender discrimination. Also, nutrient intake was falling because in the PDS systems, they saw again caste discrimination, they saw gender discrimination, etc. So all of this was playing into the polity because all parties were bringing in a majoritarian bias in their selection of representatives or for things. So this also they took pride in professionalizing the directorates, etc. But they ignored the lower part of the public health system. So the ASHAs, the health workers, etc., were given a short shrift. So as a result, again, these maternal mortality rates started, while on paper they might look good, but the ASHA workers are not actually going house to house. And if they are only tracking metrics and they're not doing the jobs that they are supposed to do.
So you mean to say there is a divergence between, the numbers and the quality?
Yeah, they're very narrowly focused on just getting that number to a certain thing. That's what they're, projecting a number based on a certain kind of measurement.
Yeah, so the focus is more on the outputs. Outcomes might be slightly different.
Slightly, they're seeing a fall in those kind of metrics, and that is cause for worry.
But still, I would, as if you compare Tamil Nadu with other states, it will still be better. But outcomes are also something which is important. For example, education. So we focus on output. So we look at enrollment numbers and all. But when it comes to the learning outcomes, it's not as good, right? So maybe we have to make that shift. And as Tamil Nadu.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one more state. We are moving to the northern parts, or rather the eastern part of India. So one more state that I studied is Odisha, and
that's your home state.
That's my home state. So I was more interested in Odisha, and I actually could relate with some of the things that Rajshekhar talks about. And for this particular state, he uses one statement that it is the state which wasted its iron ore boom. So, as most of you will be knowing, Odisha is one of those states which is rich in mineral deposits, specifically iron ore. Between 2000 to 2009, the price of iron ore increased by somewhere around 80 times, and the iron ore that was extracted from Odisha that increased by somewhere around 10 times, The exports of iron was like 16 times that increase. This is the change in some 9-10 years. So as you are extracting more iron, you are selling more iron, and the price that you're getting for iron, that has also increased. So we would assume that the state of Orissa would have got a lot of revenues, and this would have reflected in its healthcare status or education status. And so the schools would have become better, healthcare would have become better, people would have become more affluent. But what he says is this is not the ground reality. Maybe you are selling more iron ore, but you are not generating as much revenue, and the social indicators do not look really good. So why this is the case, right? You have some resources and you are able to extract those resources, but why this is not getting translated into better standard of living for the people? So these are some of the things that he tries to explore. The first thing he points out is Orissa focused a lot on extracting and exporting iron ore. Now, iron ore is something which is a low value product. And at this point of time, China demanded a lot of steel. So we are basically selling iron ore to China, exporting iron ore to China and some other countries as well. What he is suggesting is if we had converted iron ore into steel and we had exported it, then again the returns would have been much more, because steel is a high value product.
Yeah, high value.
Yeah, so we would have got better returns. And
yeah, but those require investments, I guess.
yes, it requires investments. So see, I'm from Rourkela. Rourkela is one of those steel cities, and it has that steel plant. If you look at Rourkela and the adjacent areas, you'll have a lot of these small and medium-sized plants. They also produce steel, but they're not as competitive. When the price of steel was very high, they were also producing steel, because the steel that they produce was expensive, but the price of steel in the international market was even higher. Now, but these steel plants are not that efficient because they're not operating at scale. So what Rajshekhar is suggesting is maybe the state could have incentivized these small producers to ramp up their R&D and other things. So that way they would have been more competitive. But the state is not doing that. Rather, the focus is on exporting minerals. Now, what is the reason why iron ore is only being exported? Why we did not focus on steel? So he says that the mining lobby is very strong. And if you look at the mining sector here, there are two players. One are the mine owners, those who actually own the land which has these reserves, and then there are some mining contractors. Now, among them, there is this collusion. And what happens typically here is the mining contractors who have the technical know-how to extract resources, they will inflate the price that they are charging from the mine owners. And as a result of which, what will happen? The mine owners will show that they do not make a lot of profits. So the profit before tax will be very low. As the profits are low, what will happen is the states will not get sufficient amount of taxes. So this kind of collusion existed, as a result of which the state did not get sufficient amount of revenues. And the royalty that the state was getting, it was also quite low, right? So state is not getting resources from sufficient resources, or what it should have got from the iron ore. But yeah, the third thing that could have happened is, yes, it's okay. I mean, even if the state is not getting sufficient amount of revenue, since there is extraction of iron, there is export of iron, and there are some committees which estimate that in this 10 years, Odisha might have extracted some 2 lakh crore worth of iron, right? So when you are getting 2 lakh crores in your economy, that can also boost different kind of economic activities. Yeah, different kind of other activities could have been taken up. Maybe jobs would have been created, employment opportunities would have increased, entrepreneurial activities would have emerged. But that is also not something which is happening. 2 lakh crores has entered into the economy, but most likely it has not entered into manufacturing and all these sectors. The investments primarily happened in different kind of speculative enterprises. For example, there was a phase where there was this engineering boom. So many of these players who are dominant in the mining sector, they're investing in engineering colleges, and the estimates are not appropriate. Before 2000, there were some 5 odd engineering colleges in Orissa. Between 2000 to 2010, 90 more engineering colleges emerged. Just imagine, 10 years, 90 colleges, and 60 of these colleges were in Bhubaneswar. And I was there in Orissa at that point of time. I used to wonder, like, how come these new colleges are emerging? And many of these colleges, the names will be similar, the names will be strange. And they're not investing in medical colleges and all, because
medical colleges, because that would require
more money. You will also need to have hospitals, so they're investing in easier things. So they're investing in engineering colleges, and so many colleges came up, and
but those also would have gone down.
Exactly. So do we have demand for these many engineering seats? So he points out that in 2015 there were some 46,000 seats. Out of that, 30,000 seats were lying vacant.
Oh my God!
Right. So you have pulled in your money and you are not getting any returns. And there were a host of unintended consequences. You don't have students vying for these seats. Now
teachers will get affected.
Teachers were getting affected, and on top of that, teachers were given targets that you have to get your own students.
Oh my God!
So they have to get involved in different marketing activities. So I remember these things used to happen. I mean, these colleges will go from one place to another. They will host a seminar. In the seminar, they will say that, okay, we are offering these courses. Our placements are like this. Please join. So those kind of things, and they also had to lower the examination standards, that competitive examination standards, so that they can get more people, right? So
this lowering this lowering of standards is prevalent, I think, across. Even Tamil Nadu has seen, but not at the engineering level, but at the school level, because they want to bring everybody onto the same till 9th standard. Everybody is passed, and then the first time that a student is actually tested is when he joins engineering or college. So,
but here they're again they're lowering the standards for that as well. So, so the competitive exams through which you get the engineering seats, or the minimum percentage that is required, right? So all these things they are trying to lower it. So first thing is the focus has been on exporting low value goods. Second thing was there is a collusion, as a result of which you are not able to generate sufficient revenues for the state. Third thing is whatever money is generated through these activities, they are going into different kind of speculative investments, right? So all these things leads to a situation where the Odisha government is not able to leverage on its mineral resources, and the international markets were doing well. Maybe we could have leveraged it. So this is what they pointed out. Another thing they're pointing out, it's something which happens in many other states as well. So there is this consolidation of media. So you have same players who own different types of media.
I think it's a common thread. I have read it in Tamil Nadu, in Punjab, and in the information is not getting out, right? How do people know about this?
They will not be able to know, and they will also, I mean, there's no one to hold them no one to hold government accountable as well.
So for me, the themes across the book was climate change, economy, inequalities, and social harmony. Okay, these 4 things are going to determine the future trajectory of the country. And politicians, for whatever interests and incentives they have, they will use everything under their power to steer away from these issues, because these issues are difficult issues to solve. Okay, and it is for us to be vigilant. Now, how we develop that vigilance, how we bring out that, is something that we need to really look at, is what I think is what comes out.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so as you mentioned, right, politicians, I mean, they are also at the end of the day rational actors. So we have to understand what are their incentives. How do you change the incentives so that we can address these governmental failures that are there, or the market failures that are there, right? So, for example, the kind of market failures we have seen in Mizoram. Right. So I think this is what is more important. And we just talked about some states, but many of these things are equally applicable for other states as well.
Yeah. Like he says in the book, he's just picked these states, not for any particular reason, just, out of random curiosity. So I guess you'd find all of it in other states too.
Yes. So I think it's time we wrap up the discussion.
Sure.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll meet again in one more episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsor on the network this week, Credencia. Thank you so much for making this possible. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus was joined by actress Shreya Pilgaonkar to talk about her career in acting. On Begin the Journey, Ashish Vidyarthi lists down the modern concepts of friendship and how one can choose the right friend circle in life on Begin the Journey. On The Habit Coach, Ashton Doctor was joined by Aisha Bilamoria to talk about running and developing an athletic mentality. Farhad and Sunetra are joined by LGBTQ workplace advocate Suresh Ramdas to discuss the new normal in queer relationships on GBCD. On Tere Mere Raaste, Keshav Chaturvedi takes us to the riverbanks of Banaras and describes the soulful mornings to us. And finally, on the Positively Unlimited podcast, Chetna Chakravarti takes the fear out of the word responsibility. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Hi, I'm Zarina Poonawalla, host of the Empowering Series podcast on the IVM network. I happen to be a peak performance coach and leadership coach by profession, and I'm here to share with you productivity tools, life-altering techniques, and real-life hacks to help you achieve your maximum potential in everything you do, your relationships, professions, careers. So tune in every Monday to unleash your inner power. Be safe, be well, be empowered.